I am Trish Bretz. I'm here on staff at Bentley Memorial Library. And thank you all for coming. And I want to introduce you to Lynette Swanson, who is the Chief Sanitarian at Eastern Highland Health District. And she has a lot of great information for you. If you didn't get a packet on your chair, I'll bring some over to you in just a couple minutes. Okay. And there is a sign up sheet if you want to sign in. The information is for the folks at Eastern Highlands Health District. Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Trish. Good evening, everyone. I hope you enjoy the presentation. As she said, I'm Lynette Swanson with Eastern Highlands Health District. I've been a sanitarian for 33 years now. So I worked mainly 27 or 28 years at Northeast District Department of Health. And then I worked part-time for Eastern Highlands for 6 years. And then I've moved over there. I've been there 4 years full-time. So I've had a lot of different things happen with well water quality, both with dealing with public water systems and private homes. So we're going to give you a little bit of a background on the regulations. We're not going to go into a lot of the regulations, just a little bit. So water quality regulations. So there's the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, and that is basically for our public water systems. So Connecticut adopted those regulations under Section 1913B 102, and that's a long regulation that they have to abide by. So basically, any of our food service establishments that you have that are served by a private well, they have to follow those same guidelines that a regular Connecticut water supply would have to follow. So they have to test their water every quarter, and other constituents that they have to test for is required to do once a year or every 5 years. So, but they're pretty strict, and if they get any exceedances, especially with bacteria, then they have to test on a weekly basis for so many weeks, and it's a long process. So, but private wells, we don't have as strict regulations for you. So the private wells are regulated under 1913B 101. And those are enforceable by the local health department, where the public water systems are done by the state health department. And then we also have the well drilling code, which is regulated by the Department of Consumer Protection. They license all the well drillers, and they are the ones who issue the well permits for the well drillers to submit to us. So once anybody wants to drill a well, they want to have any work done to the well where they need the well hydro. They have to submit a permit to our office, and then we have to do a field visit, verify the locations of septics and wells, and then we can approve the permit. So basically, there are 3 types of wells that are out there still. Dug wells were the biggest type of a well that was dug way back in the day, the 20s and 30s, 40s. There are still some dug wells that are still in existence today that are being used, but they're basically dug into the ground. They're either dug with a shovel or a backhoe. They're pretty shallow because you don't want to dig. You can't dig too far if you're digging with a shovel. Once they've dug them, then they either line them with rocks or bricks, something to prevent it from collapsing in on itself. And then it was usually covered by wood, stone, or concrete. Some of the old dug wells that we come across will have just old pieces of plywood. They're in really bad shape. They're really a hazard for young people if they're running through the yard to fall into. Because typically your dug wells are about 10 to 30 feet deep. They only go as deep as they need to get to the water. So in your pamphlet, you have a little example of a dug well, but they can become contaminated very easily because they're not usually sealed properly. There's no grout inside the dug wells. It's just the stone lining or brick lining that they use to hold up the sides. The caps don't usually have a lip over the side, so animals and critters can get in there, snakes and other things. They fall into the well, they die. So when people test their dug wells, they typically will find that they have a total coliform present in their well water. and that's usually because something got in there, died. It's causing the total coliform. Fecal coliform we'll talk about later. So then there's a driven well. Driven wells are assembled lengths of 2 to 3 inch diameter pipe that are driven into the ground. They have a screened well point on the end of them so that they can get into the ground. That helps drive the pipe into the gravel. And then the screen also allows the water to enter the well. The pump is installed in one of two places, either at the top of the well or in a pump house away from the well. Driven wells are also sometimes called point wells. A lot of old lake cottages used to use point wells where they'd actually suck the water from the lake to flush their toilets and wash their hands. So an access well pit is usually dug around the well point down to the frost line, and then the water discharge pipe that extends from the pump house is joined to the well pipe with a fitting. And then the well and the pit are capped, and then with the same kind of large diameter concrete cover that you would put over a dug well. So the pit, if it is installed in a pit, then you want to make sure it's drained so that any surface water doesn't get in there and flood the well casing itself. So although the driven wells are dug deeper than a dug well, they're still relatively shallow and they have a risk for contamination getting into the well. So to minimize the risk, the well pit should be covered, as I said, with a lip of concrete, tight fitting, so that have no cracks so that nothing can get into it. The most common wells that we have in the state of Connecticut are our drilled wells. They penetrate at least 100 feet, typically down into the bedrock. Our casing by code is normally 20 feet deep. But if you have a very loose sand and gravel material that you're trying to dig the well into, then they're going to have a lot more casing because they're going to have all that sand and gravel above the bedrock. So sometimes in those cases, they have to have 100 to 80 foot of casing before they can actually get into the bedrock. And I know the well drillers, typically they give you a price of so many feet for drilling the well, and then if you have to have a casing deeper than 20 feet, that's another cost per foot of casing. So your wells in those cases can get pretty expensive. So and usually the casing itself is usually 6 inches in diameter. It's a steel casing. A sealant such as a cement grout or a bentonite clay is used to seal the well casing. Okay, and that's going to prevent any contaminants from getting into the well casing. The well is also capped to prevent the surface water from entering the well. And there's a screen on top so that no insects or rodents can get into the well through the connections, the conduit lines for the submersible pumps. So as we said, submersible pumps are the most commonly used in a drilled well. They go directly down into the well casing and they're located near the bottom of the well. You can adjust those, if you're getting a lot of sediment in your water, then you can raise you can raise up the submersible pump so that you're not so close to the bottom and you're not dragging up all that sediment. Wells with a shallow water table may use a jet pump. So a lot of the drilled wells that were done in the late 60s, early 70s, you'll find that they usually have a jet pump where the pump is actually in the basement. And that's, my house had one when I moved in. My well's only 100 feet deep. But I did switch that over to the submersible pump. So most of the wells after the 60s incorporate the pitless adapter designed to provide the watertight connection at the point where the discharge water leaves the well and enters your home. So those are the lines that are going to come into your house from the well itself. The casing, the device attaches directly to the casing below the frost line and allows the water pipe between the well and your home to be protected from freezing. The older drilled wells constructed prior to the 60s may lack of some of those sanitary features. So you may have a chance of, and I know mine was in a well pit, below grade, the casing just extended above. So you go open up those pits if you can find them, because they're usually buried underground and it's difficult to find them when you have a problem with the well. The well pump, you got to find the well because there's a foot valve down in the bottom. So that has to be replaced, and it's difficult if you don't have the previous owner putting some kind of well house or something over the location where the casing should be. I know my father was out there digging all over the yard with a crowbar trying to hit the top of the well because he couldn't find it. So the nice thing about the drilled wells is the casings are above grade, at least 6 inches. You can't miss them. So it makes it easier to locate your well if you have a problem. So our private well regulations, 1913B 101, they require private well owners to conduct specific water quality tests after new private well construction. So if you're just doing work on your well, you change a submersible pump or something like that, the law does not require you to have your water tested. We would recommend it. You need to make sure that you disinfect your well once you do any disturbance to the well, because you're going to stir up bacteria and other things. If you have an inline filter to remove sediment, once you change that filter and put the new one in and seal that back up, you should put a couple of drops of bleach in with that filter before you close it up. That way you're disinfecting in case you got any bacteria from your hands inside to prevent your contamination of your water supply. So the private well regulations require state certified drinking water laboratories to report results to the local health department for any testing that's conducted for house sales within 6 months. They have the samples grabbed by a qualified individual. And the code does allow for property owners to pick up their own samples. So you can contact the lab directly, tell them you want to have your water sampled, and they'll give you the containers and the instructions on how to do your own water samples, so you're not paying for somebody to go out and do the sampling for you. And then the regulations are enforceable by the local health department. Some water quality contaminants with established maximum contaminant levels and action levels for private wells. So your coliform bacteria, inorganic chemicals, organic chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, and PVCs are the different types of water testing that's conducted. In October of this year, they made some changes to the laws for B101 that require all newly constructed wells to also be tested for lead, manganese, lead, arsenic, and uranium, in addition to the regular parameters for coliform, nitrates, nitrites, sodium chlorides, iron, manganese hardness, turbidity, pH, sulfates, apparent color, and odor. Those were the regular testing parameters that you always had to have for a single family home. Lead, arsenic, uranium were added to the minimum testing requirements in October. So those are some new things that they added. We haven't found too much, and I have a couple of areas in one of my towns down in Scotland that have high arsenic levels. And it's kind of strange because it's just this one little area. But the only way to get rid of arsenic is to have a very expensive water treatment system installed. So coliform bacteria, as we were talking about earlier, coliform organisms are commonly found throughout the environment, and they're also in the digestive tracts and feces of warm-blooded animals. So if you get a little mouse that dies in there, you're going to get some coliform bacteria. Their presence indicates the contamination may be entering the water system, thereby creating that unsanitary condition. They generally don't cause disease by themselves. However, if present, it's assumed that disease-causing microorganisms or pathogens may also be present in your water. So some common sources of coliform bacteria. Yeah, there's some How many more do we need? This one? Yeah, there's a few extra. You're welcome. So some of the common sources of coliform bacteria, as we talked about, well casings are not adequately sealed into the bedrock, missing or broken or non-watertight caps, flooded well pits, so the groundwater is getting into your well pit and it floods over your well casing inside, and that's where the water contamination can get in. Septic systems or other sources of pollution within the zone of influence of the well. Repair work done to the water system not followed by disinfection. So if you do a pump replacement or any plumbing work to your water system, that could introduce bacteria into your system. So I inserted a couple of examples of a sanitary well cap there and a temporary well cap. The sanitary well cap is a two-piece gasketed cap that sits on top of your well. It's screened and all sealed up so nothing can get into it. The temporary caps back in the 80s and early 90s were the ones that the well drillers typically would leave on the well. No inspectors were actually going out to verify that they were putting on the sanitary well caps, so most of them just left the temporary one. If you have one on your well, and you go out and you look at that cap, look underneath, and you'll see all kinds of gaps around between the casing and the cap, and you'll see, if you open it, you'll see all kinds of cobwebs and insects and everything else inside it. It's not very nice. But, so anytime you do any work on your well, we recommend that the well drillers or you even can, replace that and put on a sanitary well cap. It's only like $35 to put a new cap on. Inadequate protected neighboring wells. Cross-contamination with non-potable water systems can be a cause of coliform bacteria. Lack of casing surface or grout to 10 feet. Leaking pitless adapters or cracked casings, leaking casings, joints, or welds. E. coli now is a fecal coliform, so that's a lot different than our total coliform. Indicator organisms are E. coli. The presence of E. coli or fecal coliforms are an indicator of fecal contamination. They pose an acute health threat if it's in your well. Many strains of E. coli may not pose a health risk. However, some strains like E. coli 0157, H7 can be fatal to an infected person. And we've heard about E. coli 0157, H7 because that's also associated with foodborne illnesses related to hamburger. If you're people eating undercooked hamburger, and then especially if they have they're younger people or elderly people that have an immune compromised system, you eat a bad hamburger that's not cooked properly and it has E. coli in it, it can be fatal. The presence of E. coli or fecal coliform increases the likelihood that other disease-causing pathogens are present and can pose a significant risk. So some sources of E. coli, a failing septic system could be a cause. Rodents, mice, squirrels entering and falling into the dug wells or improperly vented atmospheric storage tanks. Vermin nesting beneath the drilled well caps that do not provide a watertight sanitary seal. So that would be your temporary well caps. Submerged wellheads in areas where animal feces are present and stormwater runoff enters the well. So if you have a well that's close to a farm that they have their manure piles stockpiled and that runoff gets to your well, that could cause fecal coliform. Nitrates and nitrates. Both are acute parameters, so if we find that in your well water, the water would not be approved. The nitrates, if they're over 10 parts per million, you're not allowed to have more than that. And if your well comes back higher than that, then you have to come up with some kind of water treatment system, which is usually a reverse osmosis system that you have to install, which is pretty expensive. They do allow you to do what they call a point of use that goes right under your kitchen sink. But that would be the only location that you can use the water to either drink or brush your teeth or anything like that, because the rest of the house system wouldn't have the reverse osmosis on it if you didn't do a full house system.
How much is
And I don't know what they are now. I know years ago they were pretty pricey, around 20 grand. So I don't know. They're really expensive, and a lot of the high concentrations of the maximum contaminant level items usually use something like a reverse osmosis to get rid of them. So there are other systems out there, but they don't work as well as that to remove those type of constituents. So what we're talking about when you had the radon, you had high radon, you use the reverse osmosis system to get rid of it also. So, so nitrates can be an indicator of septic or fertilizer influence. So typically, we have a lot of farmland here, in especially northeastern Connecticut. So a lot of I know in Northeast we had a lot of farm areas with cows. So we had a lot of manure. Miller's Farm out in Woodstock is huge. So they use fields all over the state to spread their manure. So as the farmers are, the older generation of farmers are passing away, the children aren't getting into the farming. They don't want to do the work anymore or whatnot. So a lot of that farmland that used to be used for haying and cornfields is being sold off to developers, and they're building homes in those areas. The problem is where you find the cornfields, there's a high concentration of fertilizer in that soil. So when they drill the wells, we end up with high levels of the nitrates in the water. So then they end up having to do some kind of water treatment to reduce that level. So they have safe drinking water. Um, and then also some old orchards. There are a lot of old orchards around. So in those cases, we would want them to test also for your pesticides, because you spray the trees to kill the bugs so that you get good fruit. So there's a lot of different situations where we may require them to do more than the minimum testing on their well due to site conditions. So there may be some sites that at one time was an old junkyard. In those situations, we'd want to have them test for volatile organic chemicals, which would also include gasoline and oils and other parameters other than the pesticides. So it really comes down to the type of site and what kind of history we have when we do big subdivisions like that, when people want to try and develop, to make sure that the person going into that home that is newly constructed is going to have good quality water and a good septic system. So the MCL, as I said, is 10 milligrams per liter and considered an acute health risk. It may cause blue baby syndrome by displacing the oxygen in the blood. It's particularly harmful to children under the age of 5 years, pregnant women or nursing women, and at-risk adults with certain health conditions such as chronic anemia, pulmonary diseases. And as we said, sources of pollution could be septic system, fertilizers, and agricultural land. Sodium is just a recommended limit. It's not an MCL. So recommended limits are the level for the sodium is 100 milligrams per liter. And that says if you have more than that, you should take action, but you're not required to. It's an aesthetic type of regulation on that one. So aesthetically, it may not be pleasing because you may have a high salt concentration, salty taste to your water, but it's not required that you take care of it if you don't want to. Usually the sodium levels are only a health concern for people who have that are on a low sodium diet. So they would want to know that there's high sodium in their water before they drink it. Community systems, the public water systems, are required to notify their customers annually if the sodium content exceeds the 100 milligrams per liter. Non-community public water systems are not required to notify their customers of that. High sodium concentrations in your water can also be an indicator of your backwashing system. If you have a water softener is discharging too close to your well or draining close to your well, so now you're causing a high sodium concentration in your well. Chlorides, it's a secondary aesthetic standard set by the EPA, which is 250 milligrams per liter. The state has set that as a maximum contaminant level. So if you have well water that exceeds 250 milligrams per liter in your water for chlorides, your water supply would not be approved, and you have to take some kind of action to remove the chloride water from your water. High chloride levels can cause excessive plumbing corrosion. They impart a brackish or salty taste to the water. Chloride can be naturally occurring or man-made pollution. Typical contaminations include your road salt, salt water intrusion to wells near the shoreline, and often indicative of an on-site softener backwash. So if you have your well a dug well that's close to the road, and you have a DOT salt shed across the street, what do you think the chances are that your dug well is going to have a lot of chloride and sodium in it? Pretty high. I had that happen. So aesthetic parameters, those are your iron, manganese, hardness, hydrogen sulfide. Most common water quality complaint is due to taste, odor, color, or staining of plumbing fixtures, glassware, or laundry. So if you have a lot of iron in your clothes, come up next, you're going to find that your clothes won't stay white as white can be if you don't use bleach. You'll find little orange staining around your drains, and your fixtures will get a little corroded. So the secondary level for iron is 0.3 milligrams per liter. Levels above 0.3 milligrams per liter may cause that discolored water, an orange brown staining of your fixtures and laundry, etc. So your clothes will get yellow and things like that. And we have a lot of iron and manganese here in Connecticut, so it's very common to find that in your well water. And a lot of times it exceeds the 0.3 milligrams per liter. So that's where many people will try to take action and correct that. There's really no adverse health effects known to consumers, so that's why it's a recommended limit. It's just the fact if you don't want to have staining on your fixtures and you don't want to have discoloration of your water and your clothing, then people will take action, but it's not a requirement. Manganese, the DPH has set manganese action levels at 0.5 milligrams per liter, which is considered a health-based standard, but there's no federal health-based standard. Just the state considers it a health-based standard. Manganese levels at greater than 0.5 milligrams per liter may cause an increased health risk to central nervous systems, particularly to young children or the elderly. Secondary standard is 0.05 milligrams per liter. So levels above 0.05 milligrams per liter may cause discolored water, dark brown, or black staining of your fixtures and your laundry. So most people will do something about the manganese because of the discoloration it can leave behind. Hydrogen sulfides, that's what creates that rotten egg odor, or with sulfur reducing bacteria. They're non-pathogenic. They're a nuisance microbe that can affect the aesthetic quality of your water. So, and periodic superchlorination of your well may work to get rid of them, but they usually like to hang out in your dark areas, so your hot water tanks and things like that. Those little critters like to stay in, and then when you use your hot water, then you get the smell. So it is pretty nasty. But that's not really a requirement for testing as part of, but it's something that comes up once in a while, so we like to put it out there. Hardness, there's no secondary standard for hardness. Hard water is 150 milligrams per liter. Treatment is not recommended unless it's a nuisance. Requires a DEP permit to discharge, and There's some web articles that you can go on for private wells at the State Department of Public Health's website to look up more information on hardness. But a lot of people in our when they have a lot of concentrations of iron, manganese, and hardness, will put the water softeners in to reduce the impact of the hard water plumbing fixtures. But when they put the water softeners in, then they create another problem with the discharge because it's usually a salt brine that is used to get rid of the hardness in the water. And that backwashes onto your property in a separate dedicated system. And years ago, there was no regulation on what kind of system you discharge that to. So some people would just put a hose out their window and discharge it on top of the ground. Others would put it in their septic system. And some people would make a little dry well for that backwash to go into. But there was no regulation to say you have to stay 75 feet away from your well. So you can have a house that was built prior to the regulations and they can have a backwash line going out in front of the house 25 feet away from their well, and it's right in the front. And what happens with that backwash? Where's it going? Right to the well. So then they end up with high chlorine, chlorides, and sodium and contaminate their well with their backwash. So if you do have to get a water treatment system and you're going to put in a backwash system, talk to our office about location and what type of system would have to be installed. It's not a big system. Usually it's only a little tiny trench that's about 8 or 9 feet long that goes in separate for your backwash. The backwash for a lot of these systems will cause havoc if you put it into your septic system. It will clog it all up. And it's cheaper to put in this small little dedicated system than to put in a $30,000 septic system because it's died after 10 years. Radon, I know there was a radon in air, I believe a few, maybe a month ago or so, that Cecily did from our office. But radon isn't a required water test at this point, but the Connecticut Department of Health would recommend that you test the radon in your air in your home before you test the water. And just to kind of give you an idea, if you have 4 picocuries per liter of radon in your air, that's considered the action level. Okay, the action level for radon in water is 5,000 picocuries per liter. You need to have 10,000 picocuries per liter in the air, in the water, to make 1 in the air. So if you already have the radon in your living space and it exceeds the 4, and your water is less than the 10,000, the water is really not going to be the issue. It's addressing the cracks in your foundation in any way that radon gas is getting into your house, sealing that up. Do that first before you put in an expensive water treatment system to get rid of the radon. So interpreting your water test results, milligrams per liter equals parts per million, milligrams per liter, or micrograms per liter is parts per billion. The less than means no quantifiable amount of particular contaminant was detected, and the number following the less than sign is the lowest concentration that the lab can read. Not detected is ND, or it can have the less than sign. So you have to have the testing performed by an approved laboratory identified on the water test report. So there's, in your packet, I gave you an example of a water test report from Columbia Environmental. He's no longer in business. He finally retired, but those are the general parameters that you would have to have your water tested for back when this water test was done in 2008. You can see the sulfate, arsenic, and chlorine down at the bottom. Those were additional tests that were run. Those weren't required tests. And you can see they had a high concentration of hardness, but that's not a basis of failing the report or saying it's not approved. But I would imagine whoever had that water, they probably put in a water softener because the water is so hard. So one of the changes that the state health department made with the new law that went into effect in October, it requires real estate educational materials to be handed out whenever there's private well testing to any prospective buyers. So if you have a real estate person that you're going to be having represent you at the time you sell your house, that real estate person has to hand off one of these private well testing pamphlets. And if you don't have a real estate person, you as the homeowner have to give these out to the prospective buyer. I know no homeowner knows about these regulations, and it's never going to happen. But you guys can come and get a copy of the form if you like. I also am leaving you a copy of the a list of the state approved labs in the state of Connecticut that do private well testing. And it says just a one sheet. On the back is all the ones that are here locally that you can choose from. Just got some pamphlets on bacteria water in your wells. Recommendations for private well testing are available on the DPH website under the private well water program. And I gave you their website. If you have any questions at all, you can contact our office or you can contact them directly. You may not get a person right away because most of the state of Connecticut Department of Health are working remotely. So you can probably get more luck if you email them than if you call them. So monitoring potability of your water, that would identify any potential contamination. Test your water for the appropriate suite of parameters, which we discussed here today. Testing frequency really depends on the specific site conditions. You want to make sure you get a correct interpretation of your results. And then the test results would drive your next steps that you would want to do. There are different types of water treatments out there. So for turbidity and silt in your water, you would probably use a cartridge type sediment filter. That's just an inline filter with a canister that you can buy at a Lowe's or a Home Depot. You put that in your well line and that'll catch the sediment before it goes through your whole house system. And you change those out. If they're clear tubes that you can see the discoloration and the sediment being caught up in it, change it when it's filthy. Put a new one in. And as I said, just make sure you add a little bit of bleach to it after you change that filter. Organic chemical removal, that would be granular activated carbon filters. That's for some of your other constituents on there other than your iron and manganese. Iron and manganese, again, those can be either cash on exchange, chemical feed, or oxidation removal systems. Biological agents, so if you have E. coli or total coliform, you have a dug well that you're using and you get a lot of total coliform, you would probably want to put in a UV or a chlorine injection system to kill that bacteria before it gets to your faucet. And then hardness, again, would be cash on exchange systems. And then I gave you some information on the private well program at the DPH. They have a whole list of different types of handouts and guidance documents that you can get from anything and everything that I've talked about here today. It'll go into a lot more detail for you. But that's my little presentation. Does anybody have questions? I'm sure there's questions out here for everybody.
Do you have a list of people that do the testing that you can have?
Yes, I have some up here for you. Yep. So that's
Yeah.
the back side is the testing companies with their phone numbers and their location. And then on the front, because some of the labs only test for certain parameters, so they're abbreviated over here on the side. That's why I gave you the front page, because that'll tell you what the abbreviations stand for. Okay? So you can take these home and
Okay.
you'll be able to contact the nearest lab to you. Manchester has one right here. So
What about the well drill?
the well drillers?
Work on your well. how about your pressure tank? You know, if that is how many years before you ever check it?
Right, right. Well,
What's
usually
that
usually the pressure tanks though, they will spring a leak or your gauge on it will go before the tank usually does. But you know, look at the tank. If it's rusted on the outside, it's got to be rusted on the inside too. you know, so there's really no guidance on how frequently to change out your water tank. Your storage tanks. But I've changed mine out like every 10 years or so. But that's just me. If it still looks in good shape, then don't bother it. Once you touch it, and change it out, then you've got a whole.
Well, it's got a drain on it where you can
Yeah.
drain it.
Yeah.
What would you find in that tank? What's coming out of the
Well, it depends on what's in your water.
Like,
If you have high iron in your water and you open that drain in that tank, then you're probably going to see a lot of the sediment that's settled at the bottom of the tank come out of that faucet and end up in your pail or whatever you're putting the water into. So it'll have all that red and brown just sitting at the bottom.
so does if you had that work, replaced, and the person that does well company that comes in to replace, are they going to now take the water and have it tested? Would they do that?
They typically, the well drillers will put the water testing as part of a new well that they drill. Normally, they don't test your water if they just replace a portion of the system. So if they're replacing say they're putting in a submersible pump for you, they're pulling all those lines out, putting in, taking out your old pump, putting a new one in, and putting those lines back in. They should be disinfecting your well with chlorine and giving you the instructions on how to do it. A lot of times they pour the bleach in and they leave, and that's it. So people will turn on their faucets. You don't smell the bleach until the next day because you're not opening up all the faucets and letting the chlorine get into all of your water tanks, and the lines for the tub and the sinks all over the place. So once you get the chlorine smell in the whole house, then you want to just let the water sit at least overnight. And then you're going to flush the system all out the next day and open up everything until you no longer smell the bleach. And then at that point, you can have a water test done. So, but a lot of times they don't tell you that. And somebody will disinfect your well. If it's a rental unit, I've had that problem. The landlord disinfects the well, doesn't tell the tenants. And a couple of days after, they start smelling the bleach because they didn't tell them that they have to get it into the system in order for it to really do any disinfection of the lines. So just communication, lack of communication a lot of times, but they should be disinfecting, and then they should give you the instructions on how to properly disinfect it well, if they do any work to it. But I don't know. I can't speak for them because I don't actually see what they do, but that should be what they're doing. But, yes.
Given that there's very high levels of iron and manganese in most of the water around here,
Yes.
most of us have systems to treat it. What is your experience regarding the submersible pumps that have to work pretty hard in those high levels? Average lifespan? Do you have any anecdotal information about
I think it comes down to the type of pump that they put in.
quality of the
Pump
the actual
itself. I can say that when I had my well upgraded, they put in a submersible pump, but I would say that I probably only got about 6 years out of that pump. It wasn't a very good pump. So it was, yeah, I think it was like the cheapest one they probably could have put in. But what do I know? So I don't know anything
know.
about, now I do. So when that pump died on us, then we went out and we spent the $600 on a Gould submersible pump, and I've had no problems with it. And I'd say it's probably going on at least 20 years, because I've been in my house for 33 now. So it's lasted a long time. The only problem that I was with the submersible pump kicking on and off so much, it had worn through the electrical line. And so then we ran out of water because the pump wasn't working because there was no electricity to it. So we had to pull the whole thing out, and all it was the wire was frayed. And all we did was seal that back up, and it's still been working. So I think it all depends on, and I have a lot of iron and manganese in my water too. So I think it's just the quality of the type of pump, what size pump you put in. Those type of things are going to make a difference in how long it's going to last.
Thank-
Welcome. Yes.
Well, I've had a temporary well cover for 43 years. And the sanitary one does not look at all like, the temporary. So is that like, I need to hire somebody to put one in? I mean, the well's on 285 feet down, and honestly,
You haven't had water tested to check your quality at all?
maybe 35 years ago.
Yeah, but
The kids grew and didn't lose any teeth.
yeah,
There's no particular stains. It still tastes fine.
yeah.
So how important is it to go to the sanitary? And the other thing is, when you mentioned the caterpillar webs and the whatnot at the top, because I have taken it off, the water level still remains somewhere around 15 to 20 feet below the surface. I mean, 1 atmosphere. And I mean, we're drawing the water into the house from close to 300 feet down. So if I get egg sacs at the top, I'm not terribly concerned about it floating all the way down to where the pump is. So I mean, is it
No,
that
But
big a deal?
it does offer the chance of contamination getting in there. We did go to a site, and he had some issues with the water quality, and when we took off the well cap, there were actually mice nests right underneath the cap.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you don't know what's actually in your water until you actually do have a test done. I can't, you could have you could have just total coliform, and you've built up an immunity to it. It's not going to make you sick unless you have some other health conditions that may
So is it?
be brought out by the
So
coliform.
does the sanitary cover need to be installed by a professional well driller, or is it?
No, it doesn't necessarily have to be done by.
You take it up
Really,
at
you can go
Lowe's
to
or-
a plumbing supply
Plumbing
house and
supply
get
house
one
and get it.
yourself
Okay.
and do that yourself if
Okay.
you like. Yeah, it doesn't have to be done by a professional. You can do it as a homeowner. Yeah, but just as because it is a code requirement that your well is supposed to have a sanitary well cap on it, I like to just bring it up. So if you do have a non-conforming well cap, if you ever do decide to sell your house, at least it's a simple fix to make it code compliant, and you can do it easy enough yourself if you like to.
Thank you.
Yes.
Is there any reason to open it? If you're not having any problems?
Typically, no. So I mean, if you test your water and you find that you have total coliform, then that would be a cause for concern. But again, it's if you're not having any adverse health effects from the total coliform, like I said, you could probably live with it. It's like any kind of bacteria; you won't build up an immunity to it. But like I said, if you have E. coli in your water source, then that's a much different story, and you really have to do something about that and figure out what the problem is. So,
It's going mostly from animal feces.
typically, yeah. So it's some kind of form of fecal matter. So it could be an overflowing septic system that's breaking out on top of the ground and flowing towards your well. If you're close to farmland where you have stockpiling of manure, whether it be cow or chicken manures, those can run off. And if your well is down gradient, of those areas. Obviously, if your well is uphill, then it's not gonna be an issue as much, so, depending on the depth of your well too, so.
If your well is above the ground,
The casing.
the casing, then that people now couldn't get a leak.
Well, as
right?
long as your well casing is graded properly so that there's not ponding of water around the casing. So when you look at the casing, when we go out and inspect a newly drilled well, we're looking at how much of the casing is, you need a minimum of 6 inches of casing above the ground for conforming well casing. And then they have to have it graded so that the water and anything else will wash away from the well and not pond by it. So if you have that divot around the well, then we're going to put that up so that you have the grading so it doesn't stay around the casing. It'll go away from the casing. Just like we do with our septic systems. You want that to grade so that you shed the water away from the system, not have it sit and create a bowl effect on top of your system.
How far is the well supposed to be away from the septic system?
The public health code is 75 feet. That's if your well withdraws less than 10 gallons per minute, but they don't go by the more than 10 with private homes because most private homes don't use, even if your well takes out 15 or 20 gallons a minute, they're not going to make you put a 150-foot radius on your well to your septic because of the withdrawal rate, because you don't typically use that much water in a day. Whereas if you have a big commercial operation and they're withdrawing that much water, then they're going to want them to have a 150-foot radius from the septic to the well. And then, yeah.
Is there a state requirement that, say you're in a pit, and the casing is below ground level? Is there a state requirement that if you go into that casing, you gotta raise it up above the ground level?
You can have the wells in a pit. Even newly constructed wells can be put in a pit. But the problem with that is that they have to make sure that they grade those pits, drain them so that the water, if any water does get into that well pit, the water is going to shed away from your well casing. And what we find is even with newly constructed properties, what happens sometimes on these newly constructed homes, when we go out and we do our inspections, they haven't finished final grading of the site yet. They're still constructing, finishing up the house. The wells and septics are in. We've done our inspections. The septic's graded fine and everything is designed correctly around the well casing. They have a sanitary well cap and everything's graded correct. They have enough casing above grade. What happens is now maybe the builder doesn't way the front yard looks. The house is so much higher. He wants it graded nicer and they bring in 3 feet of fill to cover the front lawn to make it more flat and slope better, not so steep, whatever it may be. Now they put the well in a casing and put it below grade. Though they have the casing to top of ground, but it's in a pit now. So the well casing, so when we have to make them open up that well pit so we can evaluate the construction of the pit itself, because that again has to be sealed. And then they also have to have it drained. So if they don't have a drain for the water that may get into that well pit, because if you get heavy rains, like we had, a few years back in July, we had those torrential rains and everything was flooding. What do you think's going to happen in that little well pit when we get that kind of rain? And it's going to flood out your well casing, and then you're going to get that surface water into your well. So as long as it has a drain, that in that well pit, then you can still put your casing, even though it's not going to be above grade, you can have it in the pit. But it's going to be drained.
I know of an instance where the person went to work on the well, and the casing was in a pit below, and the homeowner was told that it was a state requirement that he had to bring it up.
Well, it really would depend on the construction of the pit.
And then I questioned that. It wasn't my decision, but I questioned that.
Yeah.
And he said it was a state requirement that he had to bring it up. And I didn't know whether that was a sales pitch, so to speak,
I mean, the state prefers it. The state does prefer that you bring your casing above grade.
He said it was required.
Yeah, I mean, you can still put them in a pit as long as the pit is constructed properly, sealed properly, and drained properly. So,
What's the way? A rule is just to sell more.
well, like, it is a requirement on public water systems, if they have a well that's in a pit, that has to go above grade, no question. But on a private home, it's really, if the construction of the well pit is such that it's not gonna be a potential contamination issue for the well, it shouldn't be an issue.
So if your water tastes okay, you have no problems with it, you should have it tested automatically every so many years or just.
I mean, the state, I don't know if this, the private well testing, this is their, no, this is just, this one didn't copy on the back, I'll keep that one. So on the back, this is, recommended testing for all private wells, so it gives you an idea, basic indicators, they're saying, every year. So that's just your regular profile, they're saying at least once a year. Lead, they're saying at least once in the lifetime of your home, they want you to test for lead. Arsenic, uranium, and radium at least once, and repeat it ideally every 5 years after you've done the initial test. Volatile organic chemicals, they recommend at least once. Those are all your gasolines, oil, solvents. And then fluoride every 5 years if you have a child under the age of 12. So they give you, kind of guidelines. They're not requirements. So, I mean, it's really up to you as a property owner. If you want to test your water, since I've been in my house 33 years, I think I've had mine tested 3 times. So, like every 10 years or so. I mean, I've never.
Buried,
A buried well?
buried. Well, it's under the ground. No,
It's under the patio.
Right
Yeah.
now.
Is it a drilled well or a duck well?
it's a driven, I mean, a regular.
It's got a casing?
Well,
It's got a casing?
well, a casing.
Yeah.
Three
Yeah.
houses and so.
Okay. But they buried the casing, they didn't put it in a pit or anything, they just. Well, I mean, I guess if you're not having any issues with it, I mean, I've seen wells that have, big dicks, unfortunately, there's no regulation in the public health code that says you have to be 10 feet from a deck with your well, or, you can't build your garage over it. You can. The separating distances for wells, you have to be 25 feet from a drain or any kind of surface water drain, 75 feet from any source of contamination, and 25 feet from a high water mark. Those are the state requirements for separated distances to wells. There's nothing that says you can't be right on top of the road with your, you can't, if you have a drain around your house, 25 feet, but if you don't, there's no regulation. You can be right next to the house if you want to. You can build your deck over it. You can put a porch over it. You can build a garage on top of your well. Why anybody would want to do that? It's beyond me, but somebody's done it. But in order for them to do that, they have to show me that they have a code compliant area to drill a new well if that dies. So, before I'll let them do that with the garage. But I highly say disagree with it, but I can't deny it because the code doesn't say you can't do it. So. But,
Those handouts you're gonna.
yes, anybody can take those.
How
Yeah.
much is the water?
I don't know exactly what they are now. It's like $180 for the basic test. And that includes everything that we talked about today. If you want to get testified or your full test done, those are much more expensive, and that would be like another $285 on top of the regular. It's a separate test that they would do is more expensive. And then you can just do the bacteria test, and and that would be like $90 instead of getting everything else done. Any other questions? There's one in Windsor, there's one in Manchester. I think those are the closest ones here, then there's one in Dayville. It depends on, tourism in the state. I mean, UConn, I would imagine is an approved testing organization, maybe like the state references.
we've been in for almost a year.
But it's like, you know, you're not gonna take your water sample to the state health department lab, you know.
So much for coming and for finding us great to see. Lynette, thank you so much. If anyone needs a copy of the handouts, we have that.